In front of the entire team, executives, interns, and even external visitors, he laughed out loud and mocked, "This is a recruitment error. Someone mixed up the resumes." She, standing next to the whiteboard with her hand still holding the pen, swallowed hard. The ground seemed to disappear beneath her feet. Some colleagues looked away, embarrassed. Others laughed out of fear or convenience. It was her third day at the company and the CEO of the innovation division, none other than Ethan. Caldwell, heir to the technology giant Caldwell Global, was demoralizing her as if she were an object lost in the wrong place. The silence that followed weighed more than the insult, and she, dressed in the only decent clothes she had, lowered her eyes, took a deep breath and said nothing. But what no one there knew is that she was about to change the future of the company and his life forever. Months later, during the international presentation that would define the company's destiny, Ethan stands on stage with a confident smile and begins to describe the revolutionary project that would propel Caldwell Global into a new era. But when the event director announces the name of the creator, the entire auditorium turns its eyes to the side of the stage, and she enters, wearing a sober, elegant dress with the posture of someone who no longer needs to prove herself to anyone. Ethan turns pale. The audience gives a standing ovation, and she takes the microphone and says, with the same calm as the day she was humiliated, "I created this idea when it was still a recruiting mistake, but I was the one who chose not to work with you anymore, Ethan, because some places deserve to collapse before they learn to respect." The silence was now his, and as silence filled the auditorium, a new chapter began. If this turn of events gave you goosebumps, leave a like now and subscribe to the channel. There are many more real stories that will leave a deep impression on you. The Caldwell Global building reflected the glass sky as if the entire city were suspended in its floors. This was where dreams were born or died in silence, depending on who you were when you walked through the turnstiles. For Ivy, that morning tasted like iron in her throat. Her temporary badge dangled around her neck as she rode the elevator with other employees who didn't even look at her. Her simple shoes contrasted with the high heels and tailored suits around her. She had prepared for months for this opportunity. A junior innovation position that paid minimum wage but offered something she'd never had, a chance. Floor 29 smelled of expensive coffee and distrust. The workstations were lined up like chess pieces, and conversations fell silent whenever someone in a more expensive suit walked by. In the glass-enclosed conference room, she was greeted with a brief nod by Brian, her direct manager. "You'll shadow the data team this week. Then we'll see where you fit in," he said, never taking his eyes off his tablet. Ivy smiled, but no one smiled back. The girl in the light grey dress with her hair tied in an improvised bun was invisible in an environment where only surnames spoke louder. On the second day, she asked permission to present a proposal she had developed on her own during the nights she worked as a receptionist and studied on her own. Brian laughed with some disdain. "Do you want to show something on the second day?" But he allowed it, perhaps just to see where she would stumble. The next morning, she entered the room with a folder of notes, a notebook, and her idea on the tip of her tongue. It was a behavioral analysis system to predict market trends based on open data, something that could reduce the company's costs by millions. As she spoke, some colleagues looked at each other in boredom. Others moved away from their cell phones to listen better. But in the corner of the room, leaning back with his arms crossed, was Ethan Caldwell. A black dress, shirt folded at the elbows, a watch that was worth more than anything Ivy had ever owned in her life. He watched with a cynical smile. As soon as she finished, he took 2 steps forward, looked her straight in the eye and blurted out, "Does anyone know who let this intern play CEO today? This is a recruiting mistake." Muffled laughter rose like waves that couldn't be contained. Ivy froze. Her hands shook slightly, but inside, something was starting to build. Not anger, but clarity. She was in the right place. Only maybe this room wasn't ready for her yet. The first time Ivy slept on the cold floor of an empty house, she was just 8 years old. Her mother had disappeared 2 nights earlier after a whispered phone call from behind the door. What little was left in the refrigerator, a stale apple and a bottle of water she shared with her younger brother until he was taken away by social workers who never returned. She stayed, invisible to the eyes of the system, growing up among neighbors who avoided getting involved, tired teachers, and streets that taught her to survive without complaining. She never had a birthday party, a Christmas present, or anyone waiting at the school gate. But she did have books. She rescued moldy copies from the public library, read by the light of the street lamp when the power went out, copied entire sentences by hand so she wouldn't forget. While most people played or slept, Ivy wrote codes, scribbled equations, made hypotheses in old notebooks. Once a teacher noticed he said she was different, but days later he was transferred, and Ivy returned to anonymity. At 15, she was already working cleaning offices in the early hours of the morning. She had learned to walk with her head held high amidst the stairs that treated her like furniture. Each day was a test of endurance, hunger, fatigue, loneliness. But instead of hardening, she observed, her eyes could memorize roots, names, expressions. Once, while cleaning the floor of a small company, she overheard a meeting about consumer algorithms and understood everything, even though she had never set foot in a college. It was there that she discovered that her mind worked like few others, that there was logic where others saw confusion. She began to study on her own. She hacked free courses, took notes on recycled paper, saved every penny. At 18, they tried to convince her to give up. They said that certain doors don't open for certain people. But Ivy persisted. She got a partial scholarship for a technical course. Later, she was accepted into a mentoring program aimed at vulnerable young people. There, even without resources, she attracted attention with projects that transformed data into practical solutions. He created a simple intelligence that helped single mothers find jobs close to home, and it went viral on community forums. But no one knew who Ivy was. She never showed her face. Her name was just one of many that the world had learned to ignore, until the day she saw Caldwell Global in a job posting. He knew who they were, he knew what they did, and most of all, he knew what she could change if she went in, not to prove anything to others, but to win quietly. She applied on a borrowed computer. The interview was via video call with a broken camera. When the hiring email arrived, she cried for hours, silently, as she had learned to do with everything in life. Caldwell Global's innovation department was known for one unwritten detail. To get in, you needed more than talent. You needed to fit. It wasn't enough to be good. You had to be someone Ethan Caldwell's inner circle would accept, and that rarely included someone like Ivy. The rumor about her hiring circulated like a system error. An unknown name, no prestigious university, no inherited surname. No one could understand how she had gotten past the filter. But what few knew was that, days before the hire, Ethan had made a bet during a dinner with directors and internal shareholders. It was the kind of meeting that mixed expensive wine, irony disguised as leadership, and decisions that shaped the destinies of hundreds as if they were numbers on a graph. I could hire someone off the street, put a name tag on them, and prove that even a hiring mistake can be used as a diversity ad, he said, toasting. Laughter echoed around the table. Someone joked, "I doubt I'll last a week." Another replied, "Give it a month and she'll ask to leave herself." Ethan then sealed the provocation with a proposal that would make everyone laugh. "If she lasts 3 months, I'll let her present a project myself, but if she stumbles before then, everyone here already knows. It's just another story that ends at the reception." The idea was simple. Ivy would be used as a facade of inclusion, a piece to validate external campaigns and reports on diversity, but she would never have real space. The problem was that she started to attract attention, even in silence. Her reports were delivered before the deadline. Her observations in meetings, even timid ones, were accurate. An executive caught her redoing a spreadsheet that no one had been able to decipher. Comments started to appear behind the scenes. "This girl has something." But Ethan hated unexpected things, and nothing was more unexpected than someone like Ivy showing that she was better than his own favorites. She was like a reflection he didn't want to see, someone who came from nowhere, without sponsorship, without a frame. So when she asked him to present her idea for behavioral optimization based on organic data, Ethan decided it was time to put her back in the right place. For him, she needed to understand that, in that room, ideas were not enough. And so in front of everyone he used sarcasm like a knife, recruitment error. The phrase was said without raising his voice, but it hit like a scream. And that was when the bet, silent until then, became public. The problem is that Ethan believed that would be the end of it. He had no idea that at that very moment, Ivy was starting to build something that would go far beyond any presentation, far beyond any humiliation, something that she would not create out of revenge, but out of conviction. It was on a cloudy Tuesday that Ivy had her first direct contact with Ethan. Before that, he had been just a distant figure, the kind of figure who walked through hallways as if the world had stopped to make way for him. But that day, the team was short-staffed, and Ivy had been assigned to review a report that no one wanted to touch. The task involved sensitive data from a strategic research project, and any mistake could jeopardize a meeting with international investors. She sat in a side room and spent hours redoing projections, correcting formulas, and detecting a deviation that no one had noticed. At the end of the afternoon, when she handed the material to Brian, he remained silent for several seconds, read the last page and left in a hurry without even saying thank you. Minutes later, Ethan entered the room, tablet in hand and frowning. He looked at her as if trying to understand where that girl had come from. "Did you do this all by yourself?" he asked bluntly. Ivy nodded. "Did you understand that this mistake here would have cost almost $2 million if it had been validated?" he continued, now without the ironic tone. She nodded again, her voice low but firm. "How did you learn to do this type of modeling?" he insisted. She hesitated. She didn't want to tell him that she had learned on her own, attending classes in public libraries and writing everything down in borrowed notebooks. So she simply answered, "By studying." Ethan stared at her for a few more seconds, then let out a slight laugh through his nose and shook his head. "Impressive. But be careful not to fly too high. Those who climb without knowing where they are stepping fall." And he left, leaving the door ajar. The phrase sounded like a warning, but Ivy didn't feel threatened. For the first time he had addressed her as someone who was seeing something beyond appearance. Even if it was loaded with arrogance, there was an implicit recognition there. And that sparked something inside her. In the following days he began to appear more frequently in the rooms where she was, sometimes silent, other times interrupting with technical comments. One day, during a heated discussion among managers about the direction of a project, Ivy spoke up with a bold suggestion. Ethan looked at her sideways, thought for a few seconds, and said, "It could be." It was the first time that one of her ideas had been officially accepted. Brian wrinkled his nose but didn't argue. In the elevator, alone, Ethan turned to her and said, "You're not afraid to make mistakes, that's good. And dangerous." Ivy replied without looking, "Making mistakes is what you've taught me most in life." He hadn't expected that answer. He fell silent. For the first time, her presence disconcerted him. He, who had always dominated the room, now felt that there was something about this girl that was out of his control, but instead of backing down, he decided to test her further. It was the beginning of a silent game of glances, veiled phrases, and calculated distances, and while he thought he was testing her limits, he didn't realize that he was the one who was beginning to be confronted by something he couldn't foresee: respect. And maybe, deep down, fear. Conference room 12B was packed. The entire company was waiting for the presentation of the innovation projects for the new investment cycle. There were cameras, representatives from multinationals, shareholders, and even journalists specializing in technology. Ethan, as always, would be the last to speak, but before him, each department had nominated a name to present ideas with potential for scaling. To the surprise of many, Ivy's name appeared on the list. Brian tried to argue, but Ethan shrugged. "If she thinks she has something worthy, let's listen." The truth is that he expected the spectacle of her downfall, and she, even knowing, accepted, not out of pride, but out of conviction. She entered the room with a simple flash drive, her hair tied in a low bun, and a clean, unbranded navy blue dress. She put on the slides, took a deep breath, and began. Her project was solid. She had created a predictive tool for consumer behavior based on algorithms that crossed open data and organic browsing traces. The tool promised to reduce costs by up to 30% in the e-commerce sector and increase the reach of personalized campaigns by up to 60%. She spoke precisely, without embellishments, without appeals, just data, logic, and vision. In the end, for a few seconds, silence filled the room. A silence that could have been admiration. But Ethan, sitting at the central table, crossed his legs, rested his chin on his hand, and said loudly, "Does anyone know who let this intern play CEO today?" Laughter began to appear. Some contained, others open. "This is a recruiting mistake. A pretty PowerPoint doesn't turn anyone into a strategist. It just shows that the company is desperate for social advertising." Ivy stood still. The remote control was still in her hand. The slide stopped at the last chart. Her eyes didn't look away, but her throat burned. She felt her face heat up, her spine stiffen, and the eyes of dozens of people waiting for her reaction. But she said nothing. She closed the slides, she lowered her head, and left the room. Outside, the muffled sound of laughter still echoed. Brian ran after her. "You shouldn't have presented. It was obvious he was going to bring you down." She looked him in the eyes and simply said, "I didn't present it for him. I presented it because I believe in the idea." And she left, without crying, without exploding, without begging. What would have been the end for many, for her became the silent trigger for something bigger. The next day, her name was no longer on the meeting roster. Her badge began to limit access to floors. The team stopped copying emails. But Ivy understood everything. They were trying to erase her, as they always had, as they had done her whole life. The difference was that now she no longer needed authorization to exist. All she had to do was follow. And she followed. 3 days had passed since the presentation. Ivy had not returned to the innovation department. She had not resigned. She had not responded to emails. She had simply shown up punctually, performing bureaucratic duties that had been strategically assigned to her in order to keep her out of the decision-making process. Ethan, for his part, pretended that nothing had happened. For him, she was already a closed matter. But something in the environment had changed. The climate of unshakable certainty that surrounded him was subtly unstable. Comments began to appear in the hallways. People said they had reviewed the slides. A senior technician confessed to a colleague. What she presented was not just pretty, it was possible. And while her name was being removed from internal records with the excuse of personnel reorganization, Ivy was preparing something that no one expected. In silence. She did not retaliate on social media. She did not seek justice. She simply organized folders, spreadsheets, and codes. Until the day she received an email notification, her contract would be terminated in 2 weeks. Due to failure to adapt to the corporate culture, she read it with the same eyes she had read old logic books as a teenager. She knew the game. She knew the roles. And for the first time, she decided to choose hers. The following Friday, at 4 p.m., Ivy walked into meeting room 11A with a small flash drive in her pocket and a sealed envelope in her hand. She asked to speak to Ethan. He accepted out of curiosity. His blazer was thrown over the chair, his shirt half open, and he had the smile of someone who had already won. "Are you here to apologize or to end with dignity?" he teased, crossing his arms. She sat down, placed the envelope on the table, and looked him in the eye. "I always knew about the bet." Ethan arched an eyebrow. "That night at the director's dinner, your voice is not hard to recognize. The room next door had thin walls." He was silent for a few seconds. He tried to laugh. "You got it wrong." But she didn't back down. "I understood perfectly, and that's why I decided to continue. Every slide I put together, every metric I built, I did it knowing that they were waiting for me to fall." Ethan changed his tone. "And why continue if I knew I was going to be taken down?" She answered firmly, "Because the project was never about me. It was about showing that strong ideas endure even when they are ignored." She took the envelope, opened it, and placed a registration document on the table. "This is the intellectual property deposit protocol for the system I created. I registered it in my name the morning after the presentation." Ethan looked at the paper coldly. "Are you threatening me?" She stood up slowly. "No, I'm just warning you that when this project gets off the ground, and it will, it won't be with your name involved." And before leaving, she looked over her shoulder one last time. "I knew everything from the beginning. I was just waiting for the right moment to show that those who underestimate me never understood how things really work." And he closed the door behind him, leaving not just a stagnant CEO but an entire empire with cracks in its wake. That weekend, for the first time in years, Ethan couldn't sleep. The image of Ivy, firm, serene, and completely in control, haunted him in every corner of the apartment. He tried to ignore it, rationalize it, convince himself that it was all just her hurt pride. But there was something in her speech and in her eyes that deeply disturbed him, and so he did something he never did. He looked for information on his own. He called a legal analyst and asked for a complete search on the name Ivy M. Tolland. He didn't expect to find anything relevant, but what appeared in the records made him sit back in his chair, in disbelief. Not only had she registered the system presented with the date and irreversible code, she was also listed as the creator of 2 award-winning projects in social hackathons. One of them had been recognized by a European foundation, and another had been discreetly cited by an innovation institute in Silicon Valley. But that wasn't all. When he searched the city's public records, he found Ivy's history since childhood. It was then that the impact came like a punch to the chest. She had grown up in one of the most neglected neighborhoods in the state. No registered father, mother abandoned, unstable education. An address linked to a shelter that he himself, years ago, had visited out of obligation during a company philanthropic campaign. In that same shelter, he had taken photos with children for a social impact report. One of the photos, now archived on an old blog, showed a girl of about 9 years old, with attentive eyes and an old notebook on her lap. Ethan enlarged the image. The girl was Ivy. He felt something inside him break. The life he barely looked at, she lived. And yet, she built something that none of his geniuses honed at elite universities had managed. More than that, she was the exact reflection of what he said he supported in corporate speeches, but rejected in practice. A genius without a last name, without a showcase, and now outside the company. He felt an anguish that he could not name. He went to his email and looked for his name among the senders. He saw the ignored messages, the cold replies, the declined appointments. In all of them, Ivy was trying to build, and he was trying to keep quiet. He called Brian. "Why didn't anyone tell me she had this history?" Brian laughed on the other end of the line. "You didn't want to know, you just wanted her to fail." Ethan hung up without answering. For the first time, he realized he had missed something that neither money nor status could recover. The chance to have someone by his side who saw what he never saw. And it was in that emptiness that the weight of the Caldwell name seemed insufficient. He looked at himself in the mirror, without the suit, without the tie, and he saw only a man who had bet against the future and lost. The following. Monday, Ivy's chair was empty. There was no name tag hanging, no forgotten paperwork, no scheduled emails. She simply wasn't there anymore. HR confirmed her departure as a spontaneous resignation. There was no farewell, no internal note, no formal message. To her colleagues, she was just another person who had passed by, made a fuss, and disappeared. But for Ethan, her absence had an uncomfortable, constant weight. It was as if the sound of things had changed. The reports seemed less clear, the meetings longer. The proposals that came up were full of words but without soul. He tried to maintain his posture. He kept his shirts neat, his speeches rehearsed, his decisions cold. But when he walked past the innovation department, he couldn't help but notice the space where she used to sit, always with notebooks piled high, scribbles on the edges, and eyes that paid attention even when his opinion wasn't being asked. He tried to write to her. He wrote and erased. He rewrote. He blacked. Out again. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to apologize without sounding small, and he hated feeling small. Ivy was gone. No social media, no leads, no calls. He searched the company's systems, but her email had been deactivated. The project registration document was still active, with her name on it, unique. And days passed, then weeks. And over time, echoes of her name began to appear in spaces he didn't control. A white paper in an independent journal cited an anonymous behavior prediction system that promised to revolutionize data analysis. A viral post in an academic community told of a young researcher who had turned down $1 million offer from a large company to pursue her creation in the wild. Ethan knew it was her. No one had to confirm it. Her style, her signature, the way the code was presented, everything about her was unique. And he, who had always had the world at his disposal, now felt like he had lost something that not even his power could recover. He tried a low-key approach. He sent her an invitation to an innovation conference where she could be a special guest speaker. The response came from a third party. "I appreciate it, but this is not the place I want to share my ideas." Simple, direct, elegant, and definitive. Ethan stopped trying and started observing. He missed what he had never known how to value. Her silence, which said more than the sycophants around her. Her firm presence without arrogance. Her restless mind. Her inviolable ethics. Everything he claimed to seek, but destroyed with his own contempt. For the first time he understood what regret was. Not the kind that seeks to fix the past, but the kind that weighs on the present, every day. When you realize that what you lost was greater than you could ever comprehend. The first criticisms came quietly, like footnotes. An investor questioned the lack of real diversity in the company's ranks during a live interview. A former employee made a scathing comment on a professional network. Sometimes the best ideas are discarded because they come with a temporary badge. No one named names, but those who followed closely understood. Ethan, still shielded by his last name and position, ignored it. He was used to noise. But soon the noises became voices. An opinion column in an innovation magazine raised the question, how many silent talents are wasted because of the ego of those who lead? And used as an example, an unconfirmed case of a young developer who presented a visionary project was ridiculed by a top executive and disappeared, only to resurface months later with complete mastery of the technology under her own name. The public didn't need details. The storyline was enough. The forums began to speculate. Someone found the project registration under the name Ivy. Another posted old screenshots of mentions of her at tech events. Minority groups in technology shared the story as a symbol of silent resistance. And then, one day a video resurfaced. Recorded by chance by an intern on the day of the presentation, it showed Ethan saying mockingly, "Does anyone know who let this intern play CEO?" The caption was not official, but it was enough. The video went viral. In 3 days, it had accumulated millions of views. Hashtags like Han Ero de Recrutamento and Ivy Tolland took over the networks. Caldwell Global tried to contain the damage. They released a cold note. "We are proud of the trajectory of all the employees who have passed through here." But it was too late. Ethan became a target. Interviews were declined, invitations cancelled, universities cut partnerships. At an international conference, he was booed when he went on stage, not out of envy, but because he symbolized everything that stifles talent in the name of vanity. Shareholders pressured. The numbers started to fall. His once impeccable public image now bore the stain of a name he had tried to erase, and which now illuminated an entire movement. Ethan began refusing interviews. He began using side entrances. His image lost its shine. He had become the man who had bet against the future and lost in public. But more than that, he lost to a woman who had never had to shout, who had never demanded justice in headlines, who had never asked for redress, and who, precisely because of that, had won in a way he could never understand, with dignity, in silence, and without turning back. Ethan Caldwell's office was no longer bustling. It had been a busy meeting, a phone call every few minutes, voices eager to see his approval. Now the silence was constant. Invitations were few and far between. International visitors disappeared. Eyes that had once sought his direction now looked away, as if his presence weighed more heavily than it inspired. And it was in this emptiness that Ethan saw himself for the first time, not as an executive, but as a man. He began arriving early and leaving late, not to work, but to try to figure out exactly where he had gone astray. He began to sift through old files, reports he had ignored, emails he had never responded to, ideas he had not heard, and in almost every one of them, her name appeared. Ivy Tolland. A painful reminder that he had not only failed, he had chosen to fail. Not out of ignorance, but out of arrogance. Some nights, he would sit in his car and stare at the dark building, remembering the day she had first walked in, with her simple briefcase and her steady gaze. He remembered the phrase he had uttered, recruiting mistake. It was a phrase that now haunted him like an echo. He could no longer repeat it without feeling ashamed. He tried to distract himself with new projects, but everything sounded hollow. The talent around him seemed too busy pleasing and too uninterested in challenging, and he realized with cruel clarity that he had created a bubble of convenience around himself and stifled anything that could actually create change. One day, alone in his living room, he picked up the only physical notebook he had kept from an old brainstorming session. Inside, scribbled in pencil, was a mind map that Ivy had drawn, unsigned but with unmistakable lines. It was simple, direct, and brilliant. He felt a lump in his throat. It wasn't just regret, it was grief. He was grieving for the version of himself he could have been and chose not to be. He sought out therapists. He started attending small change-making leadership meetings. He stopped wearing a suit. He gave away half his clothes. He visited the shelter where he had once taken photos for the report. But this time he didn't bring a photographer. He brought silence. He took time. He sat with young people who had never dreamed of joining a company like his. And he listened. He just listened. For the first time he learned to listen without responding, to observe without controlling. And the more he emptied himself of his old persona, the more he realized how far he had strayed from any true humanity. Ethan Caldwell, the name behind an empire, was now just Ethan, a man who realized too late that true power was never in the position he occupied, but in the courage to recognize who was truly worthy, before it was too late. It was a grey afternoon when Ethan received the invitation. It was a closed event on social innovation, promoted by an international organization that sought to connect independent developers with ethical funds. It was not the kind of environment where they expected to see him. And perhaps precisely for that reason, he decided to go. He arrived with discreet steps, without a suit, without a team, without a spotlight. He sat in the back rows, mixed in with young students, community college professors, and small entrepreneurs. The keynote presentation was by a surprise guest, unannounced for reasons of intellectual security. When the stage lit up, the murmurs stopped, and then she entered. Ivy, serene posture, sober dress, hair loose, as if she no longer carried any weight. There was no badge, no printed position, just the name, Ivy M. Tolland, independent researcher. Ethan did not breathe for a few seconds. He felt the world stop. The woman he had once called a recruiting mistake was now celebrated as one of the most promising minds of the decade. She began her presentation without mentioning names, without telling her story. She spoke about ethical technology, about the social role of data, about the importance of environments that not only include, but respect. The audience listened in silence with attentive eyes and open hearts. And he, there, motionless in his chair, felt each word as a reflection. At the end, she thanked them with a slight nod and stepped off the stage without waiting for applause. She went to the back of the room, talked to some students, hugged a lady who recognized her from an article. Ethan approached slowly. She saw him. She didn't back away. She didn't smile. But she didn't look away either. They stood face to face for seconds that seemed like hours. He tried to speak, but his voice failed, so she spoke first. "I didn't expect to see you here." He took a deep breath. Maybe I took too long to show up in the right places. She crossed her arms, not in defense but in restraint. You're different. He nodded. I'm trying to be. I still don't know if I can do it. She looked around, then turned her eyes to him. I didn't hold on to hate, Ethan. I just kept my distance. I needed space, so I wouldn't become bitter. He nodded again. I know, and I needed to lose everything to realize how blind I was. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was mature, thick, real. Then she said, as calmly as ever, what you do with what you lost is what defines whether you've truly changed. And before he could answer, someone called her from afar. She smiled slightly. Take good care of what you still have left. And she walked away, leaving Ethan standing there, in front of the most authentic version of everything he could have been, and could still try to be. The week after their reunion passed like a haze for Ethan. He relived every sentence, every look, every silence. He hadn't apologized with words, he didn't know how, but he felt that something in that brief encounter had been forgiven in another language, that of maturity. Still, a part of him needed to know if there was, in fact, a way back. Not to take back what they had lost. Perhaps that would be impossible, but to end with dignity what had begun in ruin. He discovered that Ivy had created a small educational initiative focused on self-taught young people. No grandiose brand, no banner with her face. Just concrete, discreet, transformative actions. He showed up at one of the meetings as a listener. She noticed him in the background but didn't react. He stayed until the end, without announcing himself, just observing. Then he left a note with the receptionist. If you accept, I'd like to meet you for coffee, just to listen, without trying to fix the past. 2 days later, he received the answer by text. A time, a simple place, in a quiet neighborhood. She was already seated when he arrived. 2 coffees on the table, one empty, the other still steaming. I didn't bring any questions, just presence, he said, sitting down. She watched him curiously, but not harshly. Most people only come back when they want to prove something. Ethan shook his head. I don't want to prove. I want to learn. The silence between them was lighter this time. She listened to him tell without embellishment of the empty days, the months he pretended not to feel anything, the rebuilding of a man who was raised to win, but not to respect. When he was done, she stirred her coffee slowly. You weren't just cruel to me, Ethan. You were cruel to your own humanity. He lowered his eyes. I know. She took a deep breath. And what do you expect from me now? He thought before answering. Nothing. I just wanted you to know that I saw it. Late, but I saw it. She nodded slowly. That's more than most people try to do. The waiter passed by, and she asked for the check. He tried to pay, but she waved him off. We don't owe each other anything, and maybe that's why we can leave here feeling weightless. He wanted to ask if she was saying goodbye, but he understood that such a question was unnecessary. She stood up lightly, put on her coat, and looked at him one last time. I don't carry resentment, Ethan, but I don't carry expectations either. Some stories end better when we don't insist on rewriting them. He sat there watching her walk away down the narrow sidewalk. There was no anger, no explicit longing. There was peace. And in that peace, an answer. She had forgiven him, but she decided to leave anyway. The coffee shop had already emptied by the time Ethan left. The wind on that autumn afternoon was cool but not biting. He walked slowly down the tree-lined street, past simple storefronts and park benches. At a corner, he stopped in front of a small bookstore with a light blue facade. On the glass, handwritten in white chalk, was the inscription, Big ideas fit into simple notebooks. He smiled slowly. He went inside. The bell on the door tinkled softly. There were no more than 3 people inside. He walked to the stationery section and picked up a brown notebook, unlined and unmarked. He ran his fingers over the texture, as if touching something that had always been there waiting. He went to the cashier, paid silently, and left with the bag in his hands. A block away, he sat on a park bench, placed the notebook on his lap, and with the same pen he had carried for years, a pen too expensive to have been used so little. He wrote on the first page, "First thing I learned too late. Listening changes everything." Then he closed his notebook, leaned back against the bench, and stood there, motionless, watching the comings and goings of ordinary people, as if he were seeing the whole world for the first time. A boy rode by on a bike. An old woman offered birdseed to two birds on the ground. A young woman, wearing a loose sweatshirt and headphones, was reading a book, leaning against a tree. Ethan just watched. He didn't try to control, predict, or win. For the first time, he just was. And in silence, as Ivy had done from the beginning, he allowed life to speak without needing to explain anything. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched something inside you. So tell me in the comments with just one sentence, "I also saw it too late to us," and let's talk about it together. Take advantage and leave a like to strengthen this type of content. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. And now, without leaving here, the video that is playing on your screen has an even stronger twist. Click on it and get ready, because the next story will also move you.